Hi everyone, my name is Reggie and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing with you all of the books I read in the month of September. This is an exciting month for me because I read 14 books this month, which is wild. 5 of those I actually read within 24 hours. I vlogged that experience, so I'll definitely link that video up in the eye if you want to see more about me reading 5 books in one day, which was amazing. But moving on, if you're new around here, I do organize my wrap-ups from the lowest rating to the highest rating. The point of doing this is to ensure I end on a positive note at the end of my video. So we'll start off with the lowest rated book I read this month. And for me, that is I Hate My Selfie by Shane Dawson. I was never into Shane Dawson. I did not like his humor. I always went back every so often to see if he had changed, if I had changed, if we meshed. Never did, never liked his content up until about a year ago when he started to really change his format and get into more like deep, hard-hitting stuff. There was a video that was suggested a couple of years ago when it came out that was like why I didn't go to VidCon. And it was him talking about his mental illness and anxiety and stuff like that, which was amazing video. But his videos still weren't like that great. But like about last year, he started doing some series where he sat down with his family. Then he started the docu-series. So I have been a huge fan of Shane Dawson for like the last year or so. And he's become like one of my favorite YouTubers. I think his narrative style, his editing, he's just very, very good at crafting a compelling narrative. And I think that's something I'm very interested in. So I was definitely on board with his content. And I forgot how much I hated his old content. This book is definitely his old content. A lot of his jokes are cringy or problematic. I mean, he just says a lot of things that aren't great. Overall, I did not like this book that much. I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Emergency Contact by Mary H.K. Choi. Oh boy. Let's start off with a synopsis. This book is about a girl going off to college. She's a freshman in college, and she meets her roommate's like relative. I think he's like a cousin or an uncle or something through marriage. He's like 21. So basically an incident goes down and he needs a ride to the hospital. She is there and gives him that ride and they exchange phone numbers. They begin talking and have a very open dialogue and communication. And we see how their lives progress separately. We have the dual narrative. This book is the epitome of me having mixed feelings about a book. So many things were done so poorly, so poorly. Some things I hate in books is like when people just don't act like people normally would in realistic situations. I hate like the idea of people hiding things that are silly to hide. So there's a lot of things in this book that I really hated. There was some like ideas of feminism that were so warped. There was sex shaming. There was just super obnoxious things. There was like so much shaming of other people. The main character was so judgmental in this book. There were things that I beg authors to do in books that were done in this book. There was a relationship that what didn't feel super insta-lovey. Main potentially romantic characters spoke to each other. They communicated. Their entire narrative is based on communicating with each other. I hate when like characters just don't talk to each other. There was a time where they had a hiccup, but they moved past it and was so small. Like they had the best communication ever. The bad things in this book outweighed the good things for me in this book. So I ended up giving this a 2 out of 5 stars. It gets me so heated because this book could have been so good and it was so not. Next up, I'm going to talk about Warcross by Marie Lu. This was my first Marie Lu. I've never read a book by Marie Lu, and I will say I was super disappointed. To be fair, I didn't think this concept seemed that interesting, but like so many people have raved about this book. So I blame myself for knowing my taste in reading and going against it. But this is a book about a young girl who is part of like this world where there's this big like gaming network. She is poor, but she in the beginning hacks her way into this game and catches the eye of the owner of this game. And the story picks up from there. She is basically enlisted as like a kind of spy for him to figure out who's actually hacking the game and things like that. I really liked that we had a diverse cast, that we had a book set in different place. I really liked that there was some poverty or poor characters. However, this book is basically YA female version of Ready Player One. So, to be fair, way less misogynistic and gross compared to Ready Player One, but the storytelling, the narrative direction, like all of it was so reminiscent of Ready Player One, and I I don't know if you would have ever read Ready Player One and then read this, if you would have liked it, because everything felt so predictable, like it was the same book, only like for a different audience. And if you don't know, I kind of hate Ready Player One, so I wasn't slated to like love this book. I'm not a big video game fan, so it makes sense that I wouldn't like really be invested in this world. That's not to say you have to love video games to be invested in this story. I think you can definitely like it without. And I'm not saying that there's necessarily a bad thing about a story being similar to Ready Player One, because even though I hated Ready Player One, so many people liked it, and it's nice to like bring that kind of idea to a new audience, younger people, and kind of facelift the problems from Ready Player One and put them in a nice shiny YA package. Yeah, I just wasn't impressed. I gave this a 2 out of 5 stars. Next up, we have A Work in Progress by Connor Franta. This is one of the books I read in those 24 hours, so you can check the vlog to hear my thoughts about reading this book. But essentially, this is a memoir by the popular YouTuber Connor Franta, and I'm a decent-sized fan of Connor Franta's, but obviously not the hugest of fans because this book came out years ago and I only now read it. I thought it was great. I think Connor Franta is a good writer. I think he held his purpose, his tone, everything like that really well. I think he had some really strong ideas and good things to say. However, I will say, it just didn't wow me. It's just basically what I expected for someone as well-spoken and open as Connor Franta is. I just kind of, this is what I expected from him. So I wish it would have like kind of delivered a little more than I expected. I wouldn't say it was bad by any means, but it just wasn't like wowing me. So I get a 3 out of 5 stars. Unless you're a big Connor Franta fan, I would pass. I don't think you're going to get a lot out of it if you're not a fan. Next up, we have Note to Self, which is also by Connor Franta. This is his second book. It's a little more freeform, freeing in that he has like poetry, some like train of thought processes, like some pages that aren't fully edited in like a conciseness way. He just kind of like does his own thing. I think it's so different from his first book because it presents ideas in a different way. It's less let me tell you about my life, it's more like let me tell you about my thoughts. And I think it was wonderfully done. However, again, just kind of a little bit more than his first book was. I think the concept of it was better, but it still was like not all I was hoping for. I would give this like a 3.5 or a 4 stars. So the angle's different. I probably look a little different, and that's because this is filmed hours later because I realized I forgot to talk about one book. I was walking Yogi and I was like, I didn't talk about that book. Shoot. So here we are. I gave a 3.5 stars, which is why it's sitting right here, to Sweet Bitter by Stephanie Danler. This was Stephanie Danler's debut book. It came out a couple summers ago and it hit the New York Times bestseller list. It was one of those books that, I mean, I think this happens a lot on the adult New York Times bestseller list. A book will come out, a lot of people will like it, talk about it, buy it, it'll have a lot of hype, and because it hits New York Times bestseller list, then other people will read it and will not like it, and then they'll end up with mixed reviews. I think this book is a clear condition of that. That's a thing that happens decent amount of times, I found, and I think this is what happened to this book. This book you'll get mixed reviews on. I wanted to give this book a 4 stars majority of the time I was reading it. I was enjoying it, I was interested, I was invested, it was gritty, it was different. I mean, it was your standard story, but it was so different. I was fascinated, but there are a couple things that happened at the end that made me uncomfortable, and I was super confused by the ending, so there's that. Let me tell you what this book is about. Sweet Bitter tells the story of a young girl who's moving to New York City after graduating college. She's in her 20s, and she decides to get a job as a back waiter at a restaurant. She ends up getting the job. It is at a very, very, very prestigious restaurant. She makes a good amount of money working at this restaurant because it is that big. It is set like in the New York Times Square. And the writing was superb. Loved it. Like I said, a couple things at the end made me uncomfortable and confused, so I definitely felt like I fell a little bit out of love with it at the end. I just wanted it to keep going in the direction it was. So I ended up giving it a 3.5 stars, but it was really good and interesting. So if it sounds good to you and you've been interested in it, I wouldn't let the negative reviews turn you off of it. I think it was worth the time reading. I just wish the ending made more sense to me. Maybe. Next up, we have Quidditch Through the Ages by Kenilworthy Wisp. I almost said Smith. Definitely not that. This is actually one of the books in the Harry Potter world. This is obviously Quidditch book, so it was actually written by J.K. Rowling. I listened to the audiobook of this because they re-released it. It was narrated by Andrew Lincoln, and they added some bonus content in it. I think the bonus content in this was not as good as the bonus content in Fantastic Beasts. However, I think the narration of this was better than the narration of Fantastic Beasts. Overall, rereading experience of this was pretty similar, that I Didn't enjoy it as much in a reread as I did the first time, but it was still great. It was still like enhancing the like Harry Potter experience and blah blah blah, all that good stuff. So I did really enjoy it. I think the narration was great. I think it was still interesting. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Lock and Key, A Small World. This is a graphic novel written by Joe Hill, illustrated by Gabrielle Rodriguez. If you don't know, Lock and Key is my all-time favorite graphic novel series, and this is a spin-off prequel based in that world, but you know, set way in the past. So if you don't know the story of Lock and Key, the original graphic novels follow this family who have a tragedy, strike. They ended up having to move to, I believe it's Massachusetts, where their old family home is, and the house is like wild. They have all these different keys that do different things. It's super spooky, mystical, like very well written, so smart, perfect for this time of year. So this is a prequel that was published not too long ago. I'm so happy I read it. I loved it. It was great. However, it follows different characters and I didn't feel quite as invested in those characters. This is a prequel set like 100 or 200 years in the past. So this is a different family but set in that still mystical house. I didn't feel as connected with these characters, but I enjoyed them. I love the story. I love the art style of this. But they are talking about doing more comics from this perspective, from these characters' eyes. So hopefully in getting more of their story, I come to love them and grow more attached to them. And yeah, I'm excited for the potential of more Lock and Key content in my life because I love it. And I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. That was another one of the books I read in 24 hours if you want to check out that vlog. Next up, I read I Was Born for This by Alice Oseman. This is my first Alice Oseman book. I've been hearing nothing but great things about her books, especially Radio Silence, which I still really want to read now more than ever. However, I loved this book. So this book impressed me so much, and I didn't think I would love it as much as I did. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars, but whew, it was great. This is a book about a young girl who's super obsessed with a boy band. She is going to, I don't remember the location, I assume London, to meet her online best friend. They became friends over speaking online about the ARC. She is somewhat popular, famous in the like fandom world for the ARC. Like she has like 10,000 followers on Twitter, on her ARC Twitter and stuff like that. So she is meeting her like best friend and they're going to go to an ARC concert. And we have 2 perspectives. So that's our first. Our second perspective actually follows one of the main band members of the ARC. So much diversity. There are so many important topics discussed. There is such a like beautiful nuanced take on fandom. It's not just like discussing fandom like woo fans. It's very beautifully constructed and kind of takes down some of the stereotypes a lot of people have about fandoms and people who are in fandoms. Our main character, Angel, really talks about that in a lot of detail, like how a lot of people expect fans to be one way and they're not all that way. In fact, a lot of them aren't even that way. Also love that you'd expect this kind of narrative where you have one of the members of the band and you have a fangirl of the band. You expect there to be a romance. There's no romance. I love it so much. At least there's no romance between those 2 characters. It's so good. Some other diversity we have. We have a trans main character. We have a bi main character. We have a character who's dealing with alcoholism. We have a character who's dealing with intense anxiety. Just so many great things happening. And I fell head over heels in love with this book. I love Alice Oseman's writing. Next up is a book I read during the 5 books in 24 hours vlog, and that is The Other Side of Lost by Jessie Kirby. If you don't know, Jessie Kirby is one of my favorite authors. She wrote my favorite book, Golden, and this is her newest release. It follows our main character who is a social media influencer. She has about 700, maybe 800,000 followers on Instagram. And in the beginning of the book, we discover that it's her birthday and that a few months ago, her cousin passed away. And her cousin and her were best friends when they were younger, but they have since grown apart. Towards the beginning of this book, our main character goes on her social media, posts a breakdown talking about how social media is fake, how, you know, a lot of things she's done aren't real or it's perception, talking about how she feels about her cousin. Her fans don't react well to her breakdown. She decides to delete her social media and goes to hike the trail that her cousin intended to hike. So a part of this book is set in Yosemite, which is my favorite place in the whole wide world. Also, Jessie Kirby is one of my favorite authors. And Jessie Kirby, I don't know how she does it every time, but she found a way for a part of this book to like connect with me super hardcore. And so for me, that was like the cousin used to be close when you were kids and grew apart. As you grew older, I was super close with my cousin when I was younger, and we just like don't really talk that much anymore. We're just in very different stages of our lives. And so that part connected with me, and I was like, oh my gosh, if this happened to me and my cousin, like I would hate this, like blah, 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 like all that stuff. So like Jessie Kirby has a way of finding like a little nugget that this situation didn't happen to me, but like a nugget connects with me, and I put myself in that character's shoes, and like if the things that are happening to her happen to me, how I would feel. And like that's what Jessie Kirby's writing always does to me. In every book I've had like a nugget I've clung to and then like completely immersed myself in that character's shoes, and it makes a reading experience so much more raw and beautiful. And I love Jessie Kirby's writing. It's pretty simplistic, but like she really gets it. I don't know how to explain it. Plus she is from California, writes a lot of her books, or I think all of her books are set in California. I grew up in California, and she talks about a lot of the places in California that a lot of people don't necessarily talk about, like not San Francisco and LA, like example Yosemite. So big fan of Jessie Kirby, and just a lot of the ways her writing has always resonated with me. This is no different. I did have some like small issues with communication that never gets explained. And with the romance, I didn't necessarily dislike the romance. I actually kind of liked it, but I didn't like that it was there at all, kind of. Like, there was nothing wrong with the romance, but I think the book would have stood stronger without the romance. Also, the social media component took a backseat in the second portion of the book, which I was fine with. But if you go into this book expecting it to be a, like, deep dive into, like, social media, it's not that, so I can see how that would be disappointing for you. Overall, I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I have Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. I own a copy of this book, but it's in the other room. This is another book where I kind of had some issues with the romance, but it's par for the course. YA romances are never, like, for me, what they are to other people. And so, I'm not surprised by that, but I just really didn't like one of the romances, and I didn't like how the two romances, like, were so, like, parallel, and, like, that was weird. Everything else about this book was fantastic. So if you do not know, Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi is a South African-inspired adventure story. Basically, we have this girl who comes from a world where magic was stripped from the kingdom by the king, and she finds herself on a journey to try to restore magic to her people. And so through this narrative, we see a lot of, like, parallels and discussions about what it means to be, like, an African American or just, like, a Black person living in the world today. It has a lot of, like, really like ideas of systemic issues addressed in this, like, fantasy world, and I think it's so smart the way it does that. I'm super excited to continue on with this series, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read a nonfiction memoir. You know I love those. I read a book called When They Call You a Terrorist, a Black Lives Matter memoir by Patrice Cunt-Cullors and Asha Blondell. Gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. It was amazing. This is basically just about one of the girls who founded the Black Lives Matter movement, and it's from her perspective in various times of her life before the movement, when she was trying to, like, you know, make change, but it wasn't necessarily classified as a Black Lives Matter movement, when they delved into that world, you know, when that initiative started to, like, gain traction, like, all different stages within her life and this movement. And it's beautiful and it's wonderful, and I really, really loved it. It's very strongly told and powerful and moving, as you'd expect a book like this to be, so definitely recommend it. 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, we have two of my favorite books of the year, and I honestly can't pick between them which one's my favorite, but we'll start off with Sadie by Courtney Summers. I read this as an audiobook. Highly recommend this book as an audiobook. It's, wow, what an audiobook. So as you can expect, the book called Sadie stars our main protagonist named Sadie, and she is on a hunt, essentially, for the man who murdered her sister, and her younger sister at that. So basically, Sadie is a strong, independent woman. Her mother left them. So she basically was a mom to her younger sister, and after her younger sister is murdered, she feels like she knows who did it, and she goes on, like, a spree, a hunt to try to find him. And it is so raw and emotional and, like, beautiful but sad, hard to read. It's also told in a dual narrative. So the first narrative is from Sadie's perspective, going through the hunt of trying to find this guy. The second perspective is a podcast that is actually called The Girls, and this podcast is actually about Sadie going missing. So you see the timelines kind of diverge, you see different components come into play together. It's so good. Macmillan also did produce this podcast. Since they obviously had to do some of it for the audiobook, they just straight up produced it. So you can get that podcast where like podcasts are traditionally found. I really, really loved this book. It's got heavy topics. Not the easiest to read, but I think it's so, so important that this kind of book exists and this narrative is out there. So there are trigger warnings for rape, pedophilia, self-harm, suicide, alcoholism, drug use. If there's more, I'll list them in my Goodreads review. But yeah, hardcore stuff, but it's so, so good. The last book I have to talk about today is The Poet-X by Elizabeth Acevedo. This is a Latinx story about a young girl who lives in the Bronx and is just kind of experiencing life and finding her voice as she gets into writing poetry, etc. It's so beautiful, and it's told in verse as you'd expect a book about poetry to be done, and it's just so, so good. I read this so quickly. It was one of those books I read in the 24 hours, and it is just so good. Highly recommend this book to you. This came out in like March or something, and I'm so angry it took me this long to read it. Sorry that was such a long video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And that is all. Like I said, I'll see ya in the next video. Bye!